The Battle of Iwo Jima from February 19th to March 26, 1945, was one of the bloodiest engagements in Marine Corps history. The island, 8 square miles of volcanic ash and rock, had no natural source of fresh water. Every drop consumed by 70,000 Marines had to be brought ashore in 5-gallon cans, transported through enemy fire, and guarded against desperate Japanese infiltration attempts. The water buoy was not a formal military occupational specialty. It was a hazardous duty assignment, often to quartermasters and support personnel, that placed non-infantry Marines directly in the line of fire. The photograph of Sergeant Frank Ritter of Philadelphia and Sergeant Edward M. Lipski of Massachusetts at a water dump in March 1945 captures men who represent thousands of unsung logistics personnel whose labor made combat possible. Water dumps became focal points of the battle. Japanese General Tadamichi Kuribayashi understood that American logistics, not just American firepower, would decide the island's fate. His strategy of tunneling and night infiltration specifically targeted supply lines, including water storage points. Iwo Jima means Sulphur Island, and from the moment the first Marines waded ashore on February 19, 1945, they could smell it. That rotten egg stench of volcanic vents rose from the black sand, mixed with cordite and blood. But there was something else the island lacked, something the Marines discovered within hours of landing. No water, not a single natural source, no streams, no ponds, no wells that hadn't been poisoned or destroyed by the retreating Japanese. The island, so critical as an emergency landing strip for B-29 superfortresses bombing Tokyo, was a 40-square-mile rock with nothing to drink. Before the invasion, military planners had calculated everything. They knew how many shells would be needed. 22,000 naval shells in just 3 days of pre-landing bombardment. They knew how many men, 74,000 Marines in the assault force. They knew how many ships, 880 vessels carrying 110,000 total personnel. But water was the one thing they couldn't manufacture on site. The Pacific Fleet had solved logistics problems before. For the Iwo Jima operation, they'd assembled what one contemporary newspaper called a floating naval base, more than 400 support vessels including repair ships, tugboats, and even a ship that did nothing but bake bread. There were floating dry docks, floating hotels, floating hospitals. But water still had to come from somewhere, and that somewhere was distillation ships, evaporation vessels capable of making 120,000 gallons daily, and tankers carrying fresh water from the Marianas. From ship to shore, the water traveled in 5-gallon cans, the same kind of containers that held fuel and oil. These cans were loaded onto landing craft, run through the surf, and deposited on beaches still under enemy fire. But getting the water to the beach was only the beginning. Getting it to the front lines was the job of the water boys. By March 1945, when Sergeant Frank Ritter and Sergeant Edward Lipski posed for this photograph, the beaches of Iwo Jima had become a strange paradox, utter chaos organized into a system. The water dump at Yellow Beach 1 was one of several distribution points established after the initial landings. Naval Photographic Center footage from D+8, February 27th, shows exactly what Ritter and Lipski experienced. The original caption reads, MS Pan, water distillation and supply dump on beachhead covered with camouflage net. Then, MS, Marines at water distillation unit fill tank trailer from hose. These were not combat Marines. They were quartermasters and support personnel whose training had prepared them to manage inventory, not evade sniper fire. Yet here they were, on the most densely populated piece of real estate on Earth, surrounded by 80,000 American Marines and 23,000 Japanese soldiers, most of them invisible, all of them underground. General Kuribayashi, the Japanese commander, had built a fortress beneath the island's surface. 1,500 rooms connected by miles of tunnels, pillboxes and caves by the thousands. His command center lay beneath 75 feet of solid rock with walls 5 feet thick and a roof 10 feet thick. From these positions, his men could observe every American movement, including the water dumps, and they knew exactly what those dumps represented. In a battle of attrition, and Kuribayashi knew this was a battle of attrition, logistics decide everything. An American without ammunition can't fight. An American without food grows weak. But an American without water in that volcanic heat, surrounded by sulfur vents and the constant exertion of combat, has hours, not days. The Japanese had prepared for their own water needs. Before the invasion, they'd constructed 5 massive storage tanks on the island, described as water or fuel tanks, buried and camouflaged against aerial observation. These tanks, now showing evidence of shelling, had been intended to sustain the garrison through exactly this kind of siege. But by March, those tanks were empty or destroyed. The Japanese defenders, those who remained alive in the tunnels, were now as thirsty as the Americans above them. Sergeant Frank Ritter of Philadelphia and Sergeant Edward M. Lipski of Massachusetts. We know their names. We have their photograph. But the full story of what they did on Iwo Jima, the individual moments of terror, the daily routine of moving water through a kill zone, lives only in the aggregate experience of thousands of men like them, the water boys. The job was deceptively simple: move water from the beach distillation units to the front lines. The reality was anything but. From the beach, water traveled in those 5-gallon cans, loaded onto trucks or trailers or sometimes carried by hand. The terrain of Iwo Jima, soft volcanic ash that swallowed wheels and tracks, made every movement a struggle. Vehicles bogged down, men sank to their knees, and all the while, Japanese mortars searched for supply columns. Captain Worrell Reed Carter, Commodore of Service Squadron 10, later documented the staggering scale of logistical support required for Iwo Jima. The numbers include 4,100,000 barrels of black oil, 595,000 barrels of diesel oil, 33,775,000 gallons of aviation gasoline, and 6,703,000 gallons of motor gas. Approximately 28,000 tons of all types of ammunition, 38 tons of clothing, more than 10,000 tons of fleet freight, more than 7,000 tons of ship supplies, approximately 1,000 tons of candy, toilet articles, stationery, ship service canteen items, and approximately 14,500 tons of fresh, frozen, and dry provisions. But water isn't in that list, because water was measured not in tons, but in gallons. And those gallons had to move forward every single day without interruption, or the offensive would stop. A Marine in combat needs at least 1 gallon of water per day, more in the heat, more under exertion. 70,000 Marines means 70,000 gallons daily minimum. Every one of those gallons had to be distilled on ships, transferred to landing craft, landed on beaches, loaded into vehicles, and driven forward through artillery fire. Then carried, often on foot, the last 1,000 yards to the men who needed it most. The water boys made that last 1,000 yards possible. General Kuribayashi understood something that many Japanese commanders never grasped, that banzai charges were wasteful, and suicide attacks accomplished nothing except glorious death. What mattered was killing Americans, as many as possible for as long as possible, and the best way to kill Americans was to target their supply lines. In the tunnels beneath Iwo Jima, Japanese soldiers watched and waited. They knew where the water dumps were located. They could see the trucks moving forward, the men carrying cans, the distribution points where supplies accumulated, and at night they emerged. The photograph of Ritter and Lipski shows a water dump protected by camouflage netting, but netting stops bullets. What really protected these dumps were armed Marines standing watch through the night, waiting for the infiltrators they knew would come. The caption accompanying the original photograph notes something remarkable, that Japanese soldiers made suicidal but futile attempts to raid life-giving water dumps like the one pictured here. Futile attempts. The Japanese who crawled out of their tunnels, who slipped past American patrols, who made it to the water cans stacked in the darkness, they weren't trying to destroy the water, they were trying to drink it. After weeks underground, after days without resupply, after watching their comrades die from wounds compounded by dehydration, these soldiers were desperate enough to risk everything for a single mouthful of American water. By early March, Japanese intelligence was reporting the situation in stark terms. The defenders were running out of everything: food, ammunition, but most critically, water. The communiques from Japanese headquarters, intercepted and decoded by American intelligence, spoke of water shortage and extreme thirst among the garrison. Some Japanese soldiers resorted to drinking seawater, a death sentence in its own way, as the salt content accelerates dehydration. Others licked moisture from cave walls or caught condensation on their uniforms. And some chose to die attacking the American water dumps. The raids were indeed futile. A handful of half-starved soldiers armed with rifles and grenades against entrenched Marines guarding the most valuable resource on the island. The Japanese died every time. They died. But each raid reminded the Americans of a terrible truth, that the enemy was everywhere, underground, invisible, watching, and willing to die for a drink. For Sergeant Ritter, Sergeant Lipski, and every other water boy on Iwo Jima, the Japanese raids were punctuations in a routine of endless labor. Each morning, water distillation units on the beach began converting seawater into something drinkable. The process was slow and methodical, boiling, condensing, collecting. From the units, water flowed into tank trailers, then into 5-gallon cans. Then the movement began. The front lines by March had shifted northward, away from Mount Suribachi and toward the island's rugged plateau. The 3rd, 4th, and 5th Marine Divisions were pushing against Kuribayashi's main defensive positions, a maze of fortified hills and interconnected tunnels that the Japanese called the meat grinder for good reason. Getting water to those divisions meant crossing ground the Japanese artillery had pre-registered. Every road, every trail, every open stretch of ground had been mapped by enemy observers before the invasion. They knew the ranges, they knew the angles, and they knew when supply trucks were coming. The water boys drove those trucks. They rode in those convoys. They sat exposed in the cabs of vehicles that every Japanese gunner wanted to destroy. When trucks couldn't go forward, and often they couldn't because the volcanic ash swallowed wheels and the shell craters blocked the way, the water boys walked. 5-gallon cans, each weighing 40 pounds, carried on shoulders or slung between 2 men across terrain that defied description. Soft sand that sucked at boots, sharp rocks that cut through soles, sulfur vents that belched poisonous gas, and always, always the threat of mortar fire. A mortar round doesn't discriminate between an infantryman and a supply sergeant. It kills everyone the same. By March 4th, the first emergency landing of a B-29 had occurred on the partially secured airfield, a damaged superfortress that would have ditched in the Pacific if Iwo Jima weren't available. That single landing validated the entire campaign. The island was already proving its worth. But the water boys kept working because the B-29s needed fuel, the ground crews needed water, and the Marines still fighting, and there were weeks of fighting left, needed to drink. When the battle for Iwo Jima finally ended on March 26, 1945, the numbers told a story of almost unimaginable sacrifice. Of the 22,000 Japanese defenders, barely 200 survived, most of them wounded, all of them captured after the fighting ceased. General Kuribayashi died in his command bunker, having inflicted maximum damage on the invaders. The Americans suffered 6,825 dead and nearly 20,000 wounded, with total casualties exceeding 27,000. On that tiny island of 8 square miles of volcanic rock, more Americans were killed than wounded in some entire campaigns. The casualty rate approached 33%. And every one of those living, fighting, dying Marines needed water. Sergeant Frank Ritter survived Iwo Jima. So did Sergeant Edward Lipski. We know this because their photograph exists and because the military didn't release casualty notifications with photographs attached. But survival didn't mean escape. Every water boy who served on Iwo Jima carried something home with him. The memory of those endless cans, that black sand, that constant fear. They returned to Philadelphia and Massachusetts and 1,000 other hometowns, and they tried to explain what they'd done. They might have said they were just supply sergeants who just hauled water, but the men on the front lines knew better. They knew that every time a water can reached their position, someone had risked everything to bring it. The water boys. In the decades since World War II, Historians have analyzed every aspect of the Iwo Jima campaign. They've studied the tactics, debated the strategy, counted the costs. They've written books about Kuribayashi's tunnels and the flag raising on Suribachi and the desperate fighting in the meat grinder. But the water boys remain in the margins, a photograph here, a caption there, a mention in a logistics report. They didn't charge machine guns, they didn't throw themselves on grenades, they just hauled water day after day, through mortar fire and sniper fire and the endless black sand so that other men could fight. And in doing so, they proved something essential about the American military, that the hardest job isn't always the most glamorous. Sometimes the hardest job is the one nobody notices until it stops getting done. There's a reason the Japanese tried to raid those water dumps. There's a reason they sent desperate, half-starved men crawling through the darkness towards stacks of 5-gallon cans. Because water is life. In the heat of battle, under the blazing Pacific sun, on an island of sulfur and death, water is life. Sergeant Frank Ritter of Philadelphia understood that. Sergeant Edward Lipski of Massachusetts understood that. They stood guard over those cans not because they were heroes, though they were, but because someone had to. The water boys of Iwo Jima never asked for recognition. They never expected medals. They just did their jobs, the hardest delivery job in the history of warfare, and then went home. But we remember them now because every Marine who fought on Iwo Jima, every man who raised that flag on Suribachi, every wounded soldier who survived long enough to reach a corpsman, they all drank water that someone brought. The water boys brought it. Frank Ritter, Edward Lipski, Water Boys.